The Ten Commandments. Do they even matter anymore? Author David Hazoni mentions that while about 90% of Americans have an opinion regarding the Ten Commandments, only 40% can name 4. While many of us think we value the Ten Commandments, the fact of the matter is most Americans view them as a symbol rather than a set of rules. However, the possibility of symbol can open more doors than we might first think. Both Jesus and the Pharisees had the Ten Commandments in mind when Matthew recounts the 2 Sabbath stories in chapter 12. And the story of the man with the withered hand seems to set up 2 opposing poles. On one side, we see the Pharisees, whom we interpret as smug religious people, questioning Jesus in order to try to prove him wrong. And on the other side, we see Jesus, who seems to prefer to break rules, overriding these commandments with compassion and grace. Now, this is an interesting dilemma. Does Jesus pit rules and intentions against one another? Does Jesus throw the 10 Commandments out the window? Now, it certainly seems in this passage that Jesus does not consider keeping Sabbath very important. If you look at many study Bibles and commentaries, you'll probably see that Jesus prefers to break rules for the sake of human need. However, rules and compassion do not always have to oppose one another. When they encountered the man with the withered hand, both the Pharisees and Jesus did not just have the Hebrew law in mind, but the whole narrative of Hebrew history. The Sabbath was connected to a story of justice and deliverance. It's kind of like when your parents tell you a story that reminds you why you should do something. Native Americans have a great gift of connecting stories of the past with actions of the present and future. This past summer, I had the privilege of accompanying our youth on a mission trip to South Dakota to minister alongside the Lakota peoples. Our main task of the week was to rebuild the powwow grounds that were to be used in the town's 100th anniversary celebration. And the supervisor of our project, Doug Dupree, was coincidentally the great-grandson of the founder of that town. Using stories, he explained that when the Lakota people held a powwow, it was to connect them with their past and with their community. You see the architecture of the powwow grounds and the color of the wood each held special significance, reminding the people of their interconnectedness with all of creation, with their past, with their deliverance from oppression. The stories Doug told related to the powwow tradition prompted his present and future actions. Now, the development of the Sabbath law connects to the story of creation, where after God labored for 6 days, God rested and enjoyed creation. The Sabbath commandment also interacts with the history of God's relationship with the Hebrews. Now, both Jesus and the Pharisees had the history of the Hebrews in mind when the commandment of the Sabbath was brought up. The book of Deuteronomy explains that to honor the Sabbath means to remember that the Hebrews will never be enslaved again. In the formulation of the 10 Commandments, Moses reminds the people of their enslavement by the Egyptians and their deliverance by God. Thus, the Hebrews should respond by honoring the Sabbath. Obeying the Sabbath has always been connected to a larger story. I'm sure the man with the withered hand probably knew that story well. The Bible doesn't mention much about this man, or even gives him a name. We can speculate that since the man was in the synagogue, he probably knew something about Torah, about Jewish law, and Jewish religion. He, like most of the Jewish population in the day, probably considered himself a Pharisee. And Jesus may have considered himself a Pharisee too. The Pharisees weren't really the bad guys everyone makes them out to be today. They were trying their best to follow God and God's commands. Now, some people in the Pharisee group, however, valued these commands and making laws over people and God's intentions. Does it sound like any of our churches? They wanted to keep the Sabbath and thought the rules established were the best way to do so. They had trouble transforming the stories of their history into the practice of their day. I wonder what the man with the withered hand thought of the stories connected to the commandment to honor the Sabbath. He probably remembered that the commandment is just not about resting from activity. The commandment of the Sabbath means to level the playing field for all persons. Exodus commands the Hebrews to let their livestock rest, to let the aliens rest, to let the land itself to rest. And not only are people commanded to rest, but to enjoy the splendors of creation. Now, I wonder, was the man with the withered hand able to labor for 6 days, as God did in creation, despite his deformity? Or was he reliant upon others to work for his livelihood? If he was able to work, it was probably in a low-wage position, as persons with disabilities in the first century were often seen as impure. Because of his status, did he have to work so hard that he did not receive a Sabbath? Was the man with the withered hand fully able to determine how he experienced Sabbath rest? A couple of weeks ago, a friend and I were approached by a man in downtown Kansas City where I work. And I could tell the man had a hard time speaking, but he attempted to articulate a few words and then pointed to a note in his hand. On it, he had written, "I have no job, no family, no money, no food, and I'm desperate. I would appreciate food or money. Thank you very much. God bless." With frantic and downcast eyes, as my friend and I attempted to communicate that we had no cash or food on hand. I wonder how difficult it was for him to ask for help, given that he could not speak and have anyone to fight for him. I wonder when the last time he experienced rest. He experienced freedom from worry of hunger or shelter. Could this homeless man ever experience Sabbath rest? Perhaps the man with the withered hand experienced Sabbath fully for the first time when Jesus healed him. See, Jesus had leveled the playing field between him and everyone else in his social circle. The Sabbath's original intent is for rest, for enjoyment of creation. And with this healing, the man could fully be restored. And in reality, Jesus did not disobey the Sabbath, but empowered the man to live fully into the Sabbath. The man could participate in Sabbath rest and renewal like everyone else. The Sabbath is when we pretend what a new heaven and new earth might look like. where, as the writer of Revelation puts it, all things are made new. Jesus does not abolish the Sabbath. Instead, he reminds us of the Sabbath's ultimate purpose, ultimate goal. The Sabbath is a time to dream, a time to hope, a time where we live at peace with all persons. The Sabbath reminds us to consider all creation as made in the image of God and prompts us to rest in God. Through Matthew's account of the man with the withered hand, we realize that to truly obey the Sabbath involves looking beyond ourselves and considering that all persons need to obey the Sabbath. If God desires for all creation to have a Sabbath, we must do our part to ensure everyone can experience this life-giving rest. This includes the homeless man gesturing for food, the single mom working late into the night, the refugee navigating a new culture. The result of keeping Sabbath is freedom to work and freedom from the burden of work. In this freedom, all can worship God fully and experience God's blessings equally. Deanna Lander exhorts that the Sabbath is a promise regarding our future glory in the new heavens and earth, a righteously just and compassionate society. So, how do we bring about this promise regarding our future glory? What does the Spirit call us to do in our own time? Who does God call us to heal in our own communities? Bringing about Sabbath is more than just dreaming. It's serving in homeless shelters. It's protesting unjust laws. It's caring for the ill. When we obey the Sabbath command, we participate with Jesus in that healing event and live into the intention of not just the Sabbath command, but the whole of the 10 Commandments. In a chaotic culture today, the humble story of the man with the withered hand offers us hope and prompts us to live that hope in the world. Let us not only focus on fulfilling this commandment, but making room for others to do also. Amen.